Alright students, welcome back to Medieval 1450. I hope you are all doing well. So today we are going to discuss the concepts of chivalry and courtly love in medieval Europe. These might be terms you've heard before. After all, knights in shining armor are something of the popular image of the Middle Ages. But let's get a bit into the reality of that image on this day. So, the first courtly love poems come from the Occitan, a region of the Provençal during the 12th century. This is a part of what is today southern France, a region in the period fairly independent from French rule. It wouldn't be until the Albigensian Crusade in the early 13th century that it would be brought under firmer French rule. Given this low level of French control and proximity to the Iberian Peninsula, its neighbor right next door, there is some suggestion that the early growth of the literature is influenced by Iberian and Arabic literature. Over the course of the 12th through 14th centuries, France, England, and parts of Italy become centers of court life and literature. In particular, these practices spread faster wherever the Normans had influence. In England, the literature really began to arrive when Eleanor of Aquitaine, the wife of Henry II and the mother of Richard the Lionheart, brought the literature and its ideals with her. This literature, in general, facilitated by the growth of the power and prominence of courts. Status among the elites revolved increasingly around jockeying for position in royal courts. Developing from the comitatus and from the increasing administrative needs of a realm, courts merged both functional roles and a place for vassals to be given status dependent upon kings. Within courts, fashion became a crucial determiner of status. Every behavior from diet to dress could gain or lose one's status, as everything became loaded with symbolism and meaning, and this was something that would carry on even well past the Middle Ages, until about the 16th or 17th century. For men, this centered around the concept of chivalry. The term comes from the French word chevalier, meaning knight or noble warrior rich enough to own a horse. That's not insignificant. Horses needed to be bred, fed, tended, and a big warhorse was not the sort of animal you used to plow a field. The ideals of chivalry incorporated both old, familiar sources of honor, but also added and formalized some new concepts. Loyalty is one such concept. Now, we've talked about keeping one's word in Hrothgar's saga a little bit, but here we're discussing concepts of loyalty more in concept with our day on lordship and rule, and in the Song of Roland. Being a good vassal, looking after the lord's interest, and fighting honorably on their behalf was also combined with the reciprocal obligation as lord to vassals. Think those oaths of loyalty from lordship and rule day. There was also a religious dimension. Publicly expressing faith in God, service and defense of Christendom, such as joining the Crusades, and prayer. This reflects both the importance of religious identity in society, but also has another rule. Rulings, like the peace and truce of God, sought to spiritualize warriors, channeling and limiting their violence and establishing what violent acts were legitimate. To support these roles as vassals and lords, largesse was also an important aspect. This refers to knights' willingness to give out wealth and land, especially to peers and those below them. This is, again, an outgrowth of the early medieval honor culture based on giving gifts. But the big new aspect of honor growing is courtesy, the following of good manners of the court. In addition to following fashion and etiquette, it also included being clever, witty, and good in conversation. Because of its literary focus, courtly love, also known as fin amour, became one of the most famous parts of courtesy. To be a good knight, a man had to dedicate himself to the service of a lady as if she were his lord. To be truly fashionable, the lady would have to be a high-ranking and unattainable woman. That's important, they had to be unattainable. This allowed the focus to be on a knight's deeds and character, not his station. Though through it, a man can be elevated socially by love and deeds done for love's sake. This helps get poorer knights on board with the idea, since this idea makes it easier for them to make a place for themselves in court. Of course, there is an inherent tension in all these behaviors. This whole fixation on a higher class woman is all well and good, but most of them happen to be married, often to the knight's lord. This means if anything untoward in this whole courtly love occurs, the knight is betraying the Lord by undermining his family and betraying God by committing adultery. Not ideal. If you've read most of the stories of Lancelot and Guinevere, they might give you a good idea of the problems. The next big issue is to critique is the place of women in this. Women are placed in a position of power, being the higher class objective and recipient of love, but they are also placed on a pedestal. They are expected to be passive and beautiful rather than to be able to make use of the power they are given. As time wore on, women's role became more restrictive as the chivalric code became more stylized. And the higher the pedestal, the harder the fall, or the easier for that fall to happen. A final issue is the contrast within the character of the knights themselves. They must be peaceful and kind, but also a strong warrior. They must present loyalty to one's lord, but courtly love can undermine it. And they must completely trust their lover, but jealousy is a primary way to show love. Well, there were solutions to some of these. When peace is valuable and the church demands it, but social status is dependent upon skill in battle, a solution was to perform in battle. Tournaments were a way to deliver the performative elements of battle, demonstrating martial prowess with far less death and devastation. It also becomes a popular sport. Just as modern sports celebrities become household names, so too did medieval knights elevate their status through victory, or at least an impressive showing, on these mock fields of battle. Of course, it was also good training for the real thing. Knights may not have gone for the kill, but they gained great skill in combat and riding horses in combat environments, perhaps the best preparation that was available for them for war. Beyond the tournaments, a great deal of emphasis was put on the pageantry of knights. This was effectively a way to perform chivalry for the court and the public. There are records of people dressing as members of Arthur's court, or trying to evoke the symbolism of those myths. In fact, the British Order of the Garter, a position for knights close to the king, met at a round table. There was even a fashion, or rather, there were even fashion books about knights' clothing. To continue that sport comparison, knighthood was an industry, and a big one. One of the major ways courtly love and culture was expressed and transmitted is through romances. Romances were told by troubadours, a form of traveling entertainer. They were closely related to minstrels, the entertainers we discussed regarding the Song of Roland. So once again, you have stories being transmitted orally at least as much as in written form. Arthur and his court were a common theme, especially for their role as symbols of chivalry and courtly virtues. They were idealized, or at least a safely mythologized royal court. Such stories were seen less as outright fiction and more historical fiction. King Arthur was not, as we generally accept today, a purely mythical figure. His stories grew out of Celtic folklore of the Bretons, that is in modern-day Brittany in northwestern France and Wales. One of the most famous of these writers of romances was Marie de France, who lived from 1160 to 1215. Although much is not known about her herself, we do know that she lived in France and England, and that her work was popular in the court of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Highly educated, she wrote in Latin, English, and the Anglo-Norman form of French of Normandy in the English court. She wrote in the form of a lay, or lays, story poems about fantastic deeds stemming from Breton folklore. One such lay is L'Envol. Let's take a look. First of all, a short rundown of the play. Who is L'Envol? L'Envol is one of Arthur's knights, but he's clearly not a respected one. Like the poorer knights who we said gain an in through courtly love, he's not of high status or wealth, but is clearly someone worthy of honor. While in the woods, who does he meet? So he ends up meeting an exceptionally beautiful woman. From a realism perspective, is she not a bit kind of suspicious? She is impossibly beautiful and impossibly wealthy, and even her servants are impossibly wealthy and beautiful. She fits very much in with the sort of medieval image of what it means to be a fairy lady, someone not quite of the natural world and somewhat superhuman. Moreover, she's in a meadow in the woods, a sort of liminal space, or space of strange and not quite earthly qualities outside human control and civilization. It is here that fairies and other supernatural beings dwell. She recognizes Lanval's virtues and takes him as her lover. We also get another proof of her being inhuman, in that she suggests she can be wherever he wants her to be. Now here's a bit of an awkward gender dynamic. She is powerful, and Lanval accepts her condition not to tell anyone. But she is incredibly passive, putting that power and beauty to Lanval's use and not to her own. Despite her status and innate power, she doesn't really have that authority or autonomy. Let's also consider Lanval's motivations. How chivalric are they? It's kind of a bit of a mix, right? Yes, he goes through the motions, but there's a pretty explicit motivation for him in finding her attractive and wanting pleasure with her. Okay, let's move forward in the plot. Lanval returns, gives his wealth, and gains status and the acceptance of Gawain and his fellow knights. Then things go wrong. What happens? So the queen, that is Guinevere, pushes him to be her lover, and he refuses. Now we have a problem here. On one hand, refusing her is a service to his lord. On the other hand, refusing her is an insult to the queen, especially when he states that he already has a lover, one who is more beautiful than the queen. It is a major insult to her, but proving it is something Lanval can't do, because even by revealing this to the queen, he has violated the rules of their relationship and lost her. We can also see some very pointed comments about Lanval's sexuality. Guinevere suggests Lanval isn't interested in her because he is gay, and that this is a major insult to his virility, a virility clearly dependent on a strong heterosexual identity. But, to really get back at him, the queen tells the king that it was Lanval who made the advances, but definitely keeps his insults to her. Here, we start getting that performative emotion we've seen in works such as The Song of Roland. We get a lot more from Lanval. Now, I put on the Monty Python King Arthur for a reason. How does the king come off in this? Just like in Monty Python in Lanval, he doesn't really come off that well. He's a bit of a doofus, right? Then this trial goes forward and things look bad for Lanval. But then, we start getting this somewhat farcical scene with the fairy lady's servants arriving and everybody ready to acquit him, only for him to say that it isn't them, but someone even more beautiful. See how the dishonor isn't because of anything done to the queen, but whether his refusal was worthy. The women are merely the objects of attraction. Finally, his lover arrives and takes him away. She takes him to Avalon, a supernatural place outside the normal bounds of the earth. One cannot remain with a fairy woman for long without losing something, especially when you break a promise to one. Now, I started mentioning the prevalence of chivalry and courtly love in our imaginations of the Middle Ages. We've had at least 2 films and 2 BBC TV shows in the 21st century alone that use King Arthur as a source material. Oh, and a bit of sci-fi as well. This here is from Stargate SG-1. However, you respond to the realities behind the ethos presented in these works. It lies behind lots of modern media, so think critically when you see the next knight in shining armor on the small or big screen. Now, our last lecture for this week will discuss the history of medieval Spain, which will be the background for our reading the Poem of the Cid, the final large text for the course. We'll structure this text like before, a lecture and a study guide. Budget some time to really dig into the text, and remember that the due date for the second essay is coming up before too long. If you have questions, let me know, and remember to review feedback on the first essays once I finally have them in.